The 2022-2023 budget that was tabled in Parliament last week by Treasury CS Ukur Yatani has received mixed reviews, with many saying it is not a poor man's budget. With a general election looming and various promises made by different political camps, what is in it for the SME sector that employs over 70% of Kenya's workforce? What incentives have been provided to the sector that was hardest hit by the COVID-19 pandemic? Most importantly, what would an SME-friendly budget look like? This is Business Now. I'm Yvonne Okwara Matole. But first, let's take a look at the highlights. And what's in it for the SME sector? Does the budget incentivize the SME sector that is the biggest employer in Kenya? And in our Made in Kenya segment, we highlight Jikokoa, a Kenyan company providing alternative cooking solutions. And of course, our big topic of the day is the budget 2022-2023 and what's in it for the SME sector. Before we get into our news of the day, allow me to remind you that you can definitely get in touch with us. The hashtag is Business Now at Citizen TV Kenya, at Yvonne Okwara. And I want to show you who my guests are this afternoon on the program. We have to discuss the budget and SMEs this afternoon. We've got Victor Otieno, who's an SME consultant, and he's also from Vifa Consult, not a stranger on the show. We'll be talking about that, unpacking it. What does it look like? And also joining us live from London, we've got Reginald Kadzutu, who's an economist and the CEO of Amana Capital. All right, we'll get to that conversation in just a moment. But first, let's update you with all the news-making headlines in the world of business. And it is a Monday afternoon, and Kenyans are still continuing to suffer at the pump, days after the country received more than 100 million litres of fuel last week. And the National Treasury is saying that they've settled part of the debt owed to oil marketing companies. Long queues are still being witnessed even today at fuel stations in various parts of the country. The shortage has crippled transport in some parts of the country, especially where border use is prevalent. And Standard Chartered Bank has partnered with Sightsavers and Light for the World for the next 2 years to upscale what they call the Future Makers Inclusive Employability Program by investing a total of 96.9 million shillings for a program that will target students with employability training schemes and map out the inclusivity barriers that underpins the growth and progress of students with disability. And the cost of renting space in malls and offices has dropped, defying the ongoing economic recovery from COVID-19 hardships and return of workers and students. Listed property investor Ilham Fahari E-Rate says office rent in top-grade buildings has dropped by an average of 16.9% over the past 4 years on increased supply. This has left mall and office landlords with subdued earnings, signaling the end of a property boom that offered investors double-digit returns. All right, so you are now updated. Definitely we'll have some more business news for you at 9 p.m. But let's get into our conversation. What's in it for you in the SME sector as far as the budget goes that was tabled by the Cabinet Secretary of the National Treasury last week? My guest here with me, Victor Otieno from Vifa Consult, and we'll be joined by Reginald Kadzutu in just a short while. He'll be joining us live from London in just a short while. So we'll get to him in a moment. And there he is. So let's begin first with you here, Victor. So just your overall thoughts on the budget and what you thought was in it for the SME sector.
I think whenever the budget is read, we have a tendency of going directly to look at the allocation rather than looking at the strategy that underpins the allocation. For me, the number one is the risk of actualizing the budget, in the sense that the budget is estimates. So these are numbers that the government hopes to achieve in terms of revenue as well as expenditure. So it's underpinned on certain assumptions. One, economy growing at around 6.6%. It's assuming that we'll have adequate rainfalls, and it's assuming that we'll have appropriate fiscal behavior in terms of expenditure. So what happens if either of them or all of them are not achieved? It means that we might not be able to, even if you had 10 billion allocated to SMEs, it might not come into place. Number two is, specifically, we know the challenges that SMEs face around access to finance markets, etc. So from an SME perspective, we are looking to see if the budget actually is addressing the actual challenges that SMEs have. And my biggest, again, worry is we still are using outdated data. We are still using 2016 MSME report as a benchmark for putting interventions or budget allocation. 2016 to date, how many years are those? Then does it mean that, it brings the question of how effective are any interventions that goes towards the SME space? Yeah,
and you raise an interesting point. I don't know if we've got Reginald here, because I'd like him to comment on the same as well. Reginald, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us here on the program. We're here with Victor Otieno, who's saying, so first of all, before we even look into allocations, it must be about strategy. Is this something that you agree with in terms of taking a look at the strategy the government would have with respect to the SME sector? Did you see any of that in the budget that was presented last week?
Thanks, Yvonne. Yes, I agree with Victor, because any budget that you come up with has to have an aim or a goal that you are trying to achieve with that budget in the larger scheme of everything. So in this place, we are looking at the SME sector. And unfortunately, Kenya has had a habit of recurrent aimless budgets, where if you look at them, you actually try to figure out what are they trying to achieve with this budget. But if we narrow it to the SME sector, there are three main problems the SME sector faces, which is capacity for the people in that sector. Number two, access to markets, and finally, access to finances. The problem that we've had in the country, all these things have been dealt with in silos by disjointed either institutions or individual private sector players, but no one has actually been able to bring them together. So if you look at the statistics, even the ones that Victor have mentioned, if you look at the highest form of education for most people in the SME and MSME sector, it's actually secondary school. So there's definitely a huge capacity gap for them to be able to scale to the level where they're competitive and they are able to transform themselves from, but you want to see mobility from being an MSME to an SME now to maybe a medium enterprise and to a full-fledged organization. So the problem that we currently have is that the budget is disjointed, not just for SMEs, but for everything. And it's a budget that tries to handle fires as they come up, but not actually lay a foundation for where we want to go as a country.
Yeah, and that's interesting about strategy, and I think perhaps that's something that we need to do a little better when we analyze the budget. So it's not just saying X amount of money has gone to this sector and X amount of money, but it's about taking a look at the overall strategy of it. So now that we've established that, did you see strategy that, says we are focusing on the SME, or we are incentivizing them, or we are trying to put in place structures and mechanisms that support the sector? Yeah, so again, based on the data that we see, we know SMEs are important. Of course, they contribute highly to GDP, employ a majority of Kenyans. We have Vision 2030 as our overarching strategy. Under Vision 2030, we have the different MTPs, MTP 1, 2, and 3, and currently the big four falls under MTP 3. Yeah. So the strategies that were laid at Vision 2030 is what we should follow, and we should be able to see a mechanism of evaluation. So that you can determine if either we are doing correct interventions or not. So what we've seen in this year's budget policy statement and the previous years, we can't see any evaluation mechanism. So if you can't evaluate whether we are moving forward or backward, how can you measure if we are actually making any progress? So for me, I think the biggest takeout from this process is we need to be able to evaluate and say, this is stimulus economic program, this is economic recovery strategy, this is what we actually want to do with SMEs, given that we have updated data and we know the challenges of access to finance, etc. How are we literally addressing some of these issues? Then look at allocation, then come review next year. Then it becomes very easy for us to talk about strategy. Otherwise, if we do different BPS and different
different allocations every year, then as he's saying, it becomes very difficult for us to analyze.
Yeah, that's right. And we'll get into the SME, details in a moment. But I just find this an interesting, subject that we're into at the moment. And I'd like us to just explore it to the end first. Reginald, a lot of what has been said here by yourself and by Victor reminds me of a tweet that you put out 2 days ago, Reginald, where you asked, is there anyone tracking the impact of the previous budgets, or do we simply do rolling budgets? And you said, we seem to have an aimless budget. At what point do you think this would be in sort of the presentation or the tabling of the budget, every year, where we say, okay, this is what we did last year? Although we sort of see that with the president, and every time he's making these addresses, the State of the Nation being one of them. But is that the sense, that you get, just rolling over from one year to the next?
Yeah, it's an annual event and annual exercise that the Treasury has to go through. Part of their KPIs, I guess. They have to come up with a budget, and I think they do it religiously, but not economically. One thing that we need to realize that a budget is a fiscal tool. It's one of the two fiscal tools that a government has. There's the budget and there's the finance bill, which is taxation. So the expenditure side and the funding of that budget. The purpose of a budget is not to handle mwananchi problems that they are facing in that year. The purpose of a budget or a fiscal tool is to direct the economy into the direction which that particular government wants the economy to be, whether it's manufacturing, service-based economy, and all that. So when you realize that there's normally an ideology for any economy, whether you are subscribed to whether prices are sticky, fixed, or flexible, determines on what impact you expect your budget or your fiscal policy to actually have. So if you do not have an ideology that you follow, then there's no way you're able to measure. So a budget is different from a personal budget. This is a fiscal tool. And when you use a fiscal tool, you're looking at things like demand, you're looking at things like employment, you're looking at things like job creation, you're looking at things like output. You're not looking at individual prices. You're not. Those are tools that sit in central bank. When people say inflation, those are tools that sit in central bank. They don't sit in treasury. So a budget can never come and address inflation. A budget in its own nature is inflationary, because when the government spends, it's actually inflationary in nature. So when we analyze budgets, we need to look, and that's why I say the budget is aimless. We need to look at where do they want to move the economy in 2-3 years' time, because this year's budget is not going to have an impact this year. Neither is it going to have an impact next year. We will most probably start feeling the impact of this expenditure happening in 2-3 years' time. But they need to have an aim of what they want to achieve in that 2-3 years time, so that when it reaches that 2-3 years time, we can see if we spend this amount of money in this structure of economy with maybe sticky prices or fixed prices, this is what we expect to happen in the long run. But what we see happening in Kenya is that every other budget is trying to fix the short-term effects created by the previous budget. So we end up having like a hamster kind of budgeting cycle, where there's a lot of movement but little progress. Okay.
What movement or incentives for movement would we have wanted to see? I think the question we asked at the start of this show is, what would an SME-friendly budget look like? What would you have liked to see addressed? Victor?
SMEs have challenges that they face that would impede them from either growing or stop them from dying. So currently we have, of course, 2016 KNBS data is saying that it was reporting that 75% mortality rate. So roughly 3 out of 5 businesses closing within the first 3 years of operation. So what you want is to invest in that sector for them to be able to grow and contribute towards socio-economic development. So we have the issue around access to finance. So the question is, how does the budget cycle support SMEs to be able to access finance? They've had several interventions across the years. We've had the affirmative action funds, your youth funds, etc. They didn't work as well. They introduced a credit guarantee scheme. They put in 3 billion as seed capital. Has that worked? We've seen 2 billion, roughly around 2 billion being disbursed out of a possible 12 billion. in this budget cycle, they've added another 1 billion.
Yeah.
But again, there are still supplementary budgets being passed, and at some point, whatever allocation has been put, then, yeah. So I think for us is, again, the lack of philosophy and the direction to really put your money where your mouth is. Interventions toward SMEs has been going on for the last decade. Their contribution toward GDP has stagnated.
Yeah, yeah.
Again, if you look at manufacturing, they say that we've allocated budget allocation towards manufacturing has grown by 140%. But if you look at manufacturing contributions towards GDP, actually service sector has actually surpassed it. So does it make sense for you to be able to allocate resources, yet the sector is not growing?
But Victor, we've often said that the SME sector is largely comprised of retail, more than anything else. And one of the things I think, surely from 2016 to date, how many years is that now? The same challenges of SMEs, unless that is old data and the challenges are new, but one of the biggest challenges facing the SME sector is access to capital. And not just any capital, but patient capital.
Yeah, for sure.
And, collateral, which perhaps, like you say, the affirmative funds try to put in place. Then there was a credit guarantee scheme. Out of a possible 12 billion, an uptake of 2 billion shillings is perhaps not a very good report, to put in. So, what's going on? If these are the same challenges and year after year we have a budget and a country that seems to say, yeah, the SME sector, that's where it's at, that's where all the growth is. So what's the disconnect?
Yeah, so I'll give you a very good example of manufacturing. Within the manufacturing space, we have the micro, small manufacturers constituting 95% of the total population within manufacturing. Yeah. And they contribute roughly 40% towards the manufacturing GDP. The 5% in terms of population contribute, these are the larger manufacturers, contribute around 60% of the manufacturing GDP. If you compare the reality of SMEs within manufacturing are small, number two, they're informal. Vis-a-vis the actual intervention, we are seeing allocation towards Rivertex. We are seeing interventions towards, SEZ and all these infrastructural projects. Yeah. Is there a link? So what we are doing is we are addressing something, but we are not addressing SMEs. So the allocation, actually, what I would have loved to see is Uhuru Market, Kariakor Market. These are the actual manufacturers we have. They have 95% of the entire population within manufacturing. What do they need? And actually just have the entire government just ensure that it's able to work and we're able to, increase their GDP contribution over time. Then over time we can shift them to a special economic zone. Otherwise, if we continue investing in SEZ, yet we know our reality is manufacturers are in Kariakor. So what does that mean? So I think that disconnect in terms of data and actual intervention is what is bringing this mismatch in terms of effectiveness of the intervention or even budget allocation towards SMEs.
I see. So, Reginald, we're investing, but just perhaps not in the SMEs. Is that correct?
Yes, to an extent. I think one thing we also need to clarify on the SMEs that we have in the country. Majority, as you said, Yvonne, are retailers. So we don't have SMEs in the sense of where we want to look at SMEs. We have people who go buy things in China and come and resell. That does not benefit the economy so much, because there's a lot of money going out, because you're buying your goods outside the country, then you come and sell here. So you find you're actually exporting money by importing and selling. And really speaking, when it comes to national policy, that is not the type of SME that the government should be worrying about much, because it does not, one, create employment. This is one person who's just buying and selling. So it does not create employment, does not create aggregate demand. So if the government invests in such SMEs, which are the majority of the SMEs in the country, are people who literally buy and resell. What we would have wanted to see in this budget? Number one, the manufacturing sector that Victor is talking about, 90% of it is agro-processing. We have portion mills and all those other things, making oil and stuff like that. 90% of the manufacturing sector in this country is agro-processing. If you look at the allocation, then that goes to the agricultural sector. This year it's actually 2.9%, down from 3.1. and 70% of the employment is in that agricultural sector. So you realize there is a mismatch between what the structure of the economy is and what the people of Treasury think the structure of the economy is. Access to capital, as you mentioned, Yvonne, will want patient capital, long-term patient capital. Credit guarantee does not give that, because it gives them commercial loans, and that's why the uptake is low. No SME can ever grow on a commercial loan, whether guaranteed or not guaranteed. They need patient and long-term capital. And a hint of them trying to think in that direction was on regulation on crowdfunding that the CS talked about, because there the SME is able now to have a bigger or larger market where they're able to actually access long-term patient funding, mostly probably in form of equity and not in the form of debt. The second one is the access to market, because if we're going to have SMEs in the manufacturing sector, Kenya is a very small economy. In terms of demand and purchasing power, we are actually a very small economy. So we have ambassadors seated in foreign embassies across this globe. We are not at war. So I'm thinking their job ideally should be actually getting markets for these SMEs, getting markets for our chicken farmers, getting markets for the guys for the geocali sector, because if all these guys start growing, we do not have a market to actually support them locally. We just don't have the purchasing power. So if what we want to see in the budget is more probably allocation, one, to make sure that there is activity going in terms of getting the markets outside of the country. That's number one. Number two, incentives on them to get capacity building, whether it's incentives on people who provide training, whether it's incentives on their own taxes, that if then they go for training, it will come out of reduce their tax base and something like that. Will be a better way of doing it. Incentives of people who buy from SMEs, so that you're creating a market from for them. There you start seeing that you're actually doing things that encourage SMEs, but the right type of SMEs. SMEs that have ability to export, SMEs that have ability to scale. Because if a government, as I said, the budget is a fiscal tool, and what they're looking at is output, they're looking at employment, and they're looking at demand. So if an SME is not going to be able to tick those three boxes, government will be wasting money on getting someone who's buying from China and coming to resell. But if someone is saying, I make tables, for example, and there is a demand for tables, let me use chicken. Ghana imports $500 million worth of chicken every year, and they import it from Asia. But we have chicken farmers here in the country, but they only produce very small scale chicken in tonnage. Maybe Ghana needs 100 tons of chicken a year. So how do we get our SMEs to be able to start producing 5 tons, 10 tons? How do we get them certified? How do we get them that long-term capital to get them modern hatcheries, modern storehouses, and things like that? So that's where now the element of strategy and plan comes to. Victor mentioned Vision 2030. Vision 2030 is a nice document, but it's not tied in the constitution. It's not like county funds which are tied to the constitution that every government has to give 15% to it. So if a new government that comes in decides that Vision 2030 is not what they want to go with, it will just be kicked on the side and moves on like that. So when it comes to literally strategy for SMEs, which is literally the economy of Kenya, by the way, about 70 to 80% of us, of the economy is informal and it's in SMEs. How do they bring these SMEs into the formal fold, and how do they invest in it? You like to start at the agricultural sector, because that's where 90% of all the activity is. That's where 70% of the people are employed. Start value addition from there, so supporting SMEs who are doing value addition from the agricultural sector, whether it's making leather shoes, packaged tea, sugarcane juice, so that we are starting exporting value-added products. You will see incomes will start increasing, demand will increase, and they'll start employing more, and your manufacturing grows and builds around the mainstay sector, which is agriculture. Then from there, you'll actually start seeing budgets that start focusing on that area. But we seem to have a fantasy that, one, we are a middle income country, so we can make Volvos, we can make cars, and that's why we find everything was local manufacturing of vehicles. Why not local manufacturing of irrigation equipment? We are suffering from a drought. Why not encourage local manufacturing of tractors and the like? Then we'll start seeing budgets that are actually focused on the SME.
Okay, yeah, and it could also be a standards issue, like encouraging the chicken farmers to perhaps meet the export quality standards. Raising some important issues. Victor, you want to?
I just wanted to raise an issue around markets, because again, markets is very important in terms of some of the challenges that SMEs face. I think other than just looking at export market, we already currently are importing. So, for instance, out of the total consumption of onions in Kenya, 30% is produced locally. So it means that we are importing around 70%.
And a good amount from Tanzania.
70% outside. So basically what we are calling import substitution. So what are we bringing that can actually be produced? So how can we be able to support onion farmers to be able to maybe grow to scale and be able to meet at least part of the demand? We import furniture, we import nails, we import a lot of stuff.
Toothpicks,
tissue papers, etc. Can we be able to even just focus on what we're importing? Can we be able to get a bit of that market share? Probably, of course, in complementary to export market, we talk about EAC market, we talk about the CFTA, the Africa Continental Trade Market, trade area, but we don't have a route to market to those. We mentioned them in documents that part of our allocation is towards CFTA, towards EAC, COMESA, etc. But we have a clear marked out strategy of this is what the market in Africa is, this is what our local manufacturers can do, then how can we literally, pragmatically be able to reach to those markets. If that is reflected in a budget, then we can actually see movement in terms of actual output. Otherwise, we will continue wishful thinking in terms of just writing documents.
And saying the same thing. Look, I want us to take a short break here on the program. When we come back, there's a few things I want us to get into. One is, the issue of data, which you've mentioned is a big thing. Why do we not, in fact, have enough data, and we keep referring to outdated data? And like you said, then that is what would help allocations and making that decision. And also something Reginald had talked about, which is crowdfunding. We're all about, looking for alternative sources of income and capital for them. So I'd just like him to get into crowdfunding and the regulations that have been proposed around that a little bit more. Perhaps that could be an avenue for many of the SMEs who are watching the show this afternoon. You're watching Business Now. We're unpacking the budget 2022-2023 and what is in store for SMEs, and if our focus and our incentives are in the right place. We'll be back with more with my guests here on the program, so stay with us. Welcome back. Thank you for staying with us. This is Business Now. We're talking about the budget that was presented last week on the floor of the House by the National Treasury, CS, and the SME sector. There's a couple of things I want us to get into, and I'm just saying this out loud so that we can make sure we get to it. The issue of crowdfunding. What is that? How does it work? What are those regulations? Is that perhaps a step in the right direction that we should be thinking about when it comes to funding or capital? I'm still here with Reginald Kadzutu, who's the CEO of Amana Capital, is joining us live from London. And here with me in Nairobi is Victor Otieno from Vifa Consult. Victor, so what were your other thoughts? I mean, you took a look at the ICT sector and, a host of other sectors. And we'll recap again what we started with about strategy, because I think that's really important. But what else stood out for you in one way or the other?
I think one of the things that stood out for me was the ICT sector. And it stood out in terms of opportunity cost. So the current allocation to ICT is around 15.6 billion. And we have something called Kazi Mtaani, which is a government creating jobs. So the question for the two is, number one is why, if you were to reallocate the Kazi Mtaani to value creation rather than which is more sustainable labor, as opposed to job creation, because Kazi Mtaani today will be there, tomorrow might not be there. And vis-a-vis what the current trend around innovation and startups across the globe, across Africa. So if you look at the news, every other day we always hear of Kenyan startup raising money. Different
and
multinationals, different
millions of dollars
have set up their hubs in Kenya. So it means that there is a real potential for Kenyans, for Kenya to reap some benefit from actually investing in innovation as well as startups. So the question is, as vis-a-vis infrastructure investment within the ICT sector, we see Konza horizontal infrastructure, we see Konza data center, we see laptops projects for schools. The question is, if you are to do an evaluation in terms of return on investment between continued investment in infrastructure vis-a-vis the softer issues around innovation. I think if you look at the trend in terms of fundraising, there is I think if you are to invest in innovation and startups in terms of enabling environment, creating the different incentives around the same, we might be able to get a much higher return on investment, especially on ICT.
That's an interesting one, especially with the startup, sector in this country, which is extremely vibrant. We've had several shows around the startup sector. Reginald, I wonder what your thoughts are on the startup sector and what perhaps you would like to see in a budget that says, yes, the government of Kenya is taking cognizance of the fact that the startup sector in Kenya is very vibrant.
When you look at the startup sector in Kenya, Yvonne, number one, I have a problem with the disconnect of in terms of innovation being only related to IT. Yeah, I'll keep on repeating this because if we don't get right the structure of the Kenyan economy, which is agricultural, 70% of the people are in the agricultural sector. Our manufacturing is agro-processing. Our innovations should be revolving around that sector. Because labor mobility, someone who has grown up knowing how to fish or farm, cannot all of a sudden, overnight, become a software engineer, a hardware engineer, and whatever. So with what you call labor mobility is not that flexible. It's sticky. It takes time to move. So if we keep on dumping money in your Konzas, for example, and I said if Google and Facebook come here and say, okay, we want to set base here in Kenya for that, we only have like 120,000 software engineers. Those two companies will take all of those, and you've created a shortage in the whole country, which now increases the cost of that labor. Yeah. So most of the startups you have seen, if you notice, most of them have white founders. The ones that have been kind of successful, so to speak, which is the truth of the matter. And number two, what we're also not told about the startup environment in the country is how many of them actually fail after raising these $10 million, $100 million. And I always have a worry with a startup that today is on Series A, pre-seed, Series A, Series B, Series C. I'm thinking, no, at what point in time does this startup be able to stand on its own 2 feet?
Correct.
Yeah. So we're also not looking at that. I know like Twiga is kind of doing well, but if funding dries up for Twiga in terms of this concessional funding, are they now generating enough revenues to be able to run their own business without being funded every other time? Yeah. So those are the questions that we need to be looking at startups. So what does the government need to do? I'll still go back to, we have an agricultural sector where we're exporting a lot of raw material, raw coffee, raw flowers, raw fruits, and everything. It's raw. There's no value addition we are putting on it. So you find we sell a kilo of black tea, premium black tea at $3 a kg. It comes here, it's put in tea bags, and 50, 60 grams is going for 40 pounds, 20 pounds, 30 pounds. So the guy who has just packaged it and added a bit of value is making 200% more than what the farmer has made. So why, honestly, we can't package our own tea? I heard you mentioning elements of toothpicks. We can't make toothpicks. Is that we don't have bamboos? If you don't have bamboos, let's start a bamboo farm. And we say in the next 3-4 years, we want to be a net exporter of toothpicks. In the next 3-4 years, we want to be a net exporter of canned fruits. In the next 3-4 years, we want to be, If we want to invest in IT, as Victor mentioned, then our education system needs to completely change. We cannot invest in an industry where we do not have the labor or the sources of capital that are going to support that industry. It will be a waste. We are churning out more, nothing against accountants, nothing against philosophers, nothing against all those guys. We are churning out more philosophers, accountants, and all, if you look at the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics data, than the people that who are needed for the 21st century economy. So unless we have those goals and say, in 3-4 years, we want to be a net exporter of such and such a product, And then you see in subsequent budgets, you should start seeing allocations to meet those KPIs for us to be able to meet that. But we do not see that from the current government. We don't see that from Treasury. If you look at Kibaki's regime, Kibaki and Raila's government, their number one main goal was we need to be self-sufficient. So they concentrated a lot on tax administration, being able to generate enough revenue, and they achieved that goal. With the other problems they could have sorted, yes, there were so many, but you cannot achieve everything. They focused on one thing. So if we are going to say SMEs is the way to go, as we always say, they are the mainstay of our economy, then we start saying SMEs in which sector? Number one, what type of labor do we need? Yeah, does our education system support? Is our education system generating that type of labor? Number three, what are our foreign diplomats doing if they are not supposed to be actually getting us access to those markets? So to speak, for example, KQ is having problems right now, suffering, but you'll find how much cargo does KQ send out of this country? Very little compared to all the cargo that gets out. Why are we not saying KQ then should be a national asset that is designed to facilitate our trade? Like that. And I think when we start thinking like that at national level, you'll find we'll start having more focused budgets, more balanced budgets, and we can actually sort out our over-borrowing problem on overpriced infrastructure.
Reginald, I want to stay with you for a moment and talk about crowdfunding for a moment, because that came up. Just for the purposes of some of our viewers, including myself, could you just break down what crowdfunding is? And is that perhaps, a place we should start looking into, considering the regulations that have been proposed?
Okay, so crowdfunding in the simplest term is the ability to raise funds from quote-unquote a crowd. Yeah, so instead of going to a bank, 3, 4, 5 banks, you are literally raising funds from the populace. It is best done digitally on secure platforms and where there's access to information. So if I'm going to crowdfund, so let's assume I've started a regional enterprise and I want to crowdfund for a new hatchery. I want to export chickens to Ghana. This platform should be able, one, to tell the people who I'm trying to get money from, one, what I'm trying to do, two, give them enough information about, one, myself as the owner of the business or the board of the business, our historical financial performances, past and all, how this money is coming into the organization. Is it coming in as a loan, at what interest, and how is it going to be paid, or is it coming into as equity? How will you get your shareholding? But what it does, what crowdfunding basically does, number one, it de-aggregates risk for investors. So in this case, if you are an investor and I'm telling you to invest in my business, and my business needs $2 million, you have to fund me $2 million, which puts all the risk, your $2 million on risk on my success. But if you are crowdfunding, I'm going to Victor, I'm going to Yvonne, I'm going to Linus, I'm going to Joe, I'm going to Aiga, I'm going to all the guys in Citizen, and I'm saying I need $2 million. So you will say, okay, I'll give you 100,000. That means you now have 1.9 million to invest in other means and be able to diversify your investments. What crowdfunding also does, it helps the SME from hopping from bank to bank, but from a central place be able to sell the success or the benefits of investing in his business, and it gets people to come to him instead of going to look at people. Crowdfunding will solve for the SME sector and the access to patient capital. This business of giving commercial banks money for onward lending to SMEs does not work. Because once that money enters Equity Bank, it becomes a commercial loan. They will verify that business based on commercial terms. They will give you a 3-year loan at 14-15%. That becomes your base return. It means whatever product you are selling needs to give you a base of 15% before you even to move operational costs. You put another 5%, that's 20%. You put profit 19.5%, which projects give you 30% in Kenya? None. So it will put all this DFI money institution money that they keep on giving to equity, big corp for onward lending to SMEs, but they can now come to a funding platform and say, yes, we want to support this SME in the agricultural sector, we want to support this SME in the manufacturing of this thing, or in the not asbestos, steel or something, tile sector. So you do a lot, especially if it is digitized and supported with most probably an enterprise system that contains data for that SME, because then you want inventory, and which is a problem that we have with most SMEs. I have information about my business which investors don't have. So investor is coming to give me money and they're thinking, but I don't know. There are a lot of things that I don't know, which makes you so risky. So once you're on a crowdfunding platform with an enterprise system, you remove information asymmetry. I, as an investor, know your business, know everything that is happening. I know you have spent $10,000 buying a generator. It is so transparent, which now delivers, reduces the risks from an SME, and also reduces the costs of borrowing for an SME or funding of an SME.
Great. Thanks for breaking that down. And possible idea for the show here, because we always try to look at what are the various avenues for capital. And that's an interesting one. And it's good to also know that, there's a thought towards putting regulations in that space as well. Thanks for breaking that down, Reginald. I want to start with our closing comments now. Victor, from you. I know one of the things that you have said today is to not just look, when we look at the budget, in terms of raw numbers, allocation here and there, but to think strategy. But also we need more data, more accurate, up-to-date information. Just close your thoughts around what you would like to see more of in this conversation.
I think any intervention that goes towards SMEs has to be based on up-to-date data. So I think moving forward, if we can be able to have a national statistics collection, something that collects data on all SMEs across the 47 counties, that would inform intervention. One of the things we should also try to refrain from is, of course, there is ideally what we want in terms of the MSME space, but there is the reality of we are informal, we are wholesale retail, we are loan manufacturing, etc. So the question is, can we be able to formulate a strategy of moving these guys from, because that's where they get the bread and butter, can we be able to move them from point A to point B as we move them towards ideally what we want? Yeah. So I think that kind of trajectory would be of practical and beneficial to both government as well as to the MSME space. All
right, thank you, Victor. Reginald, your closing thoughts on the discussion today?
Data is important. I think there's a lot of guesswork that happens at Treasury. Especially when we are using data which is 2-3 years old. Up to now, we don't even know what GDP in Q1 was, or GDP in in Q1 of this year was. And finding data in Kenya is painful. Data that is supposed to be used to make decisions on a day-to-day basis. So you wonder, what data do they use to make decisions? However, if we don't go back to the basics as a country and say, this is the structure of the economy, this is how our economy works, this is where we want to move this economy, and these are the steps we need to take, we will have a hamster kind of budget, a lot of movement, no progress, pomp, color, and all. And I guess the general populace also needs to learn that a budget is not a tool to sort out your problems in the current year. That will never happen with a fiscal policy tool. A budget has an impact 2-3 years from now, but a budget can create chaos now if it is done for the sake of just pleasing the population, like the way we are hearing in some campaign quarters.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Reginald Kadzutu, CEO of Mana Capital, joining us live from London, and Victor Otieno here from Vifa Consult. There is one comment here I want to just take a look at. Official Jack Wiz says, that's perfectly true. Young investors should be supported to stay relevant in the industry. So that's the part of our conversation done, and I will recap that. But first, this is what we typically do here every day. It's a show about SMEs. It's a show about Kenya.